They thought they could control the neighborhood until they learned the new neighbor was the new sheriff in town. Maplewood Falls was a town where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. It wasn't a place that attracted attention, and that's how the residents liked it. The sun hung low on a late afternoon, casting a soft golden hue across tidy front yards, and the occasional dog chasing after a fallen leaf. It was one of those places where the air seemed to settle in, like an old photograph that you kept on the mantel, familiar, calm, and seemingly timeless. In the midst of this picturesque scene, a moving truck rumbled slowly down Elm Street, drawing little more than a passing glance from the handful of people out and about. No one took particular note of the man in the driver's seat as he turned the wheel with practiced hands. The truck pulled into a driveway that sat at the end of the block, where a modest but well-kept house sat, tucked between two others that had been there for decades. The man parked, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet. This was Jamal Williams. He just moved in, bringing with him more than just a few boxes and furniture. He brought change. But for now, he was just another face in the crowd. Or so he thought. Jamal, a man in his early 40s, stood tall and confident. But his first impression to the neighborhood was hardly striking. He wore casual clothes, nothing flashy or too different from the typical attire of the residents. His short-cropped hair and kind smile did little to separate him from the dozens of other people who called Maplewood Falls home. And though his arrival was anything but extraordinary, there was an air of calm about him. It was the kind of peace that many of the town's residents had long forgotten how to keep in their own lives. What Jamal didn't know, as he unpacked, was that this quiet town had a different kind of peace. A peace that was sometimes disrupted by the smallest things. The type of peace that was carefully guarded by a handful of people who believed they had the right to ensure everyone followed the rules to the letter. The kind of people who took minor issues and turned them into something larger. As if it was their life's mission to maintain the perfect order, even when there was no real need for it. Among these individuals were Karen Caldwell and Peter Martin. Two longtime residents who had appointed themselves as the unofficial enforcers of the neighborhood. Karen, in particular, prided herself on knowing every regulation in the town's bylaws, even the ones that weren't strictly enforced. Peter, her right-hand man, shared her sense of order and rule-following. They were an odd pair, fiercely protective of their way of life, to the point of making everyone else feel like they were living in a fishbowl. And while they were generally well-meaning, they had a tendency to cross lines. That afternoon, they were on the lookout for their next problem. And in the distance, they saw Jamal unloading his things. At first, it was nothing more than an observation. Someone new had moved into the neighborhood. But that observation would soon turn into something else. Something that would put both Jamal and Maplewood Falls to the test. Little did Jamal know his first day in Maplewood Falls would be anything but ordinary. What began as a simple move-in would soon ignite an unexpected clash of authority and pride. One that would challenge everything the small town stood for. But there was no going back now. Karen Caldwell stood at the edge of her neatly trimmed front lawn, her hands planted firmly on her hips, as she surveyed the neighborhood. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the row of houses, always on the lookout for anything that strayed from what she considered the proper order. To her, the perfection of Maplewood Falls was something worth fighting for. Even if that meant going beyond the rules of the neighborhood association and taking matters into her own hands. She had no qualms about it. Someone had to keep people in line. Peter Martin stood a few steps behind her, nervously tapping his foot as he adjusted his baseball cap. He wasn't as bold as Karen, but he followed her lead without question. He had lived in the neighborhood for years, and over time, he had grown accustomed to her self-appointed authority. Whenever there was a complaint about overgrown grass or an improperly placed mailbox, Karen was the one they called. And when no one else stepped up, she'd roped Peter in to help her. He often told himself that he was just doing it to keep the peace. Today, Karen had her eyes fixed on a new house at the end of the street. Jamal Williams's house. From her vantage point, she saw the moving truck. The furniture being unloaded, and the brand new welcome mat placed neatly on the doorstep. At first, she didn't think much of it. New neighbors came and went. But something about Jamal's yard bothered her. It wasn't much, just a few scattered items that didn't fit the neat aesthetic she cherished. The lawn wasn't perfectly manicured. And the garage door was a little too cluttered for her taste. That was all it took. Karen turned to Peter, who was busy fiddling with his phone, and clicked her tongue. "Peter, get over here. This new guy is already making a mess." Peter hesitated for a moment, glancing down the street at Jamal, who was focused on arranging his belongings. "What's the issue, Karen?" "The issue is," Karen said with a smug smile, "he's not following the rules. He's got clutter everywhere. That yard is not up to par. I've had enough of people moving in here and treating Maplewood Falls like their personal dumping ground." Peter shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like confrontation. But he'd learned to follow Karen's lead by now. "You think we should say something to him?" "Oh, I think we should do more than say something," Karen replied, her tone turning icy. "We're not just some homeowners here, Peter. We're the ones who make sure the rules are followed. He's going to know that." With a decisive motion, Karen pulled out her phone and dialed the number for the local neighborhood association. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "This is Karen Caldwell. I've got a situation at 202 Elm Street. The new neighbor's yard is a mess. The clutter is ridiculous. We need to send someone out here to handle it." After a brief pause, Karen's eyes narrowed, and she gave a curt nod. "Yes, that's right. This needs to be addressed immediately." As Karen hung up the phone, she gave Peter a triumphant look. "We're handling this ourselves. You stay here and keep an eye on things. I'm going to make sure this gets dealt with." Peter nodded, but as he watched Karen march down the street, a knot of doubt began to form in his stomach. It wasn't the first time Karen had taken matters into her own hands. But something about this felt different. Jamal Williams hadn't done anything wrong. At least not in the way Peter saw it. But in Karen's eyes, perfection wasn't just a goal. It was a requirement. And for someone like her, there was no room for mistakes. No room for anything less than absolute order. The rules had to be followed, no matter the cost. Karen approached Jamal's house with the confidence of someone who had dealt with far worse. Peter followed at a distance, his feet dragging, as he felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had a feeling that today was going to be more than just a simple complaint. But neither of them had any idea just how much they were about to learn. Jamal stood in his garage, wiping the sweat from his brow. He had finally finished unpacking the last of the boxes. His new home, though small, was his fresh start. After years of moving from place to place due to his work, the steady job as sheriff of Maplewood Falls offered him a sense of stability he hadn't known in years. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air, and the sound of a distant lawnmower buzzed lazily in the background. It was the kind of peace he had longed for. A place to finally settle down, away from the chaos of city life. As he wiped his hands on his jeans, Jamal took a moment to survey his surroundings. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was his. The yard wasn't perfect, but he'd get to it. It wasn't something that needed immediate attention. He was just happy to be home. A rare feeling for someone whose life had always been on the move. But as Jamal stepped out of the garage and into his driveway, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see a woman with a determined stride approaching, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. She was tall, wearing a stern expression that seemed out of place in this quiet neighborhood. Behind her, a man trailed along, his eyes downcast, walking as though he were unsure of himself. "Excuse me, sir," the woman called out, her voice cutting through the air with a sharpness that made Jamal pause. He hadn't seen her coming, but now, he knew she wasn't here to welcome him with cookies. He smiled politely, trying to read the situation. But there was an edge to the woman's stance, a sense of authority that didn't belong to someone he had just met. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but calm. The woman didn't seem to appreciate his tone. "You can start by cleaning up this yard," she said, pointing to the scattered boxes and a few stray items in his driveway. This neighborhood has certain standards, and frankly, your property is bringing down the curb appeal." Jamal blinked, momentarily taken aback by the audacity. He had barely moved in. The yard wasn't a mess, it was just in the process of being organized. But before he could respond, the man standing behind the woman, clearly following her lead, mumbled something under his breath. "Yeah, you've got to follow the rules. People like you think you can just ignore them," he muttered, barely audible, but still laced with an unmistakable tone of disdain. Jamal's eyes narrowed as he studied them. These people didn't know him. They didn't know what he had gone through to get here. And they certainly didn't know who they were talking to. But he didn't let that show. His calm demeanor remained unshaken. He'd faced far worse than this. "I see," Jamal said evenly. "And what exactly gives you the authority to come onto my property and tell me how to manage it?" The woman, who seemed to take it as a personal affront that anyone would question her, straightened her back and lifted her chin. "I'm Karen Caldwell, and this neighborhood has rules. Rules that must be followed if you want to live here. And trust me, you'll want to fit in. Maplewood Falls is a place for people who respect the standards of the community." She glanced over her shoulder at the man behind her, who nodded approvingly. Jamal took a step forward, his expression unchanging. "So, you're saying the rules require me to tidy up my yard within a few hours of moving in?" Karen's gaze hardened. "That's exactly what I'm saying. You can either clean it up yourself, or we'll handle it. Either way, you'll be dealing with this." She gave a slight smirk, as if she had already won. Jamal crossed his arms, leaning against his car as he let her words settle. He could feel the tension rising, but he refused to be intimidated. His experience as a sheriff had taught him the value of staying calm in moments of confrontation, especially when people tried to push their authority where it didn't belong. "I see," Jamal said again, his voice low. "And what exactly are you going to do if I don't comply?" Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "If you don't want to do this the easy way, we'll have to escalate. We can involve the neighborhood association, or we could even call the local authorities. We don't want to make it harder for you, but you're making it difficult for yourself." Her tone dripped with condescension. Peter, standing silently behind her, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like this. He had seen Karen do this before, take control, push people around. But something about Jamal's calm demeanor made him hesitant. Still, he didn't say anything. Jamal glanced at Peter, his gaze softening for just a moment before returning to Karen. "I don't need to escalate anything," he said, his voice now firm. "What I do need is for you both to understand something." But the moment Karen had been so confident about was about to change in a way she never expected. The tension in the air hung thick, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Karen's stern expression softened slightly, as if she believed she had the upper hand. Peter, standing behind her, shuffled nervously, unsure whether he should intervene or let his partner continue her crusade. Jamal, however, remained as calm as ever, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. A quiet confidence radiating from him. He had dealt with confrontations in his past. Real confrontations, where lives were at stake. Not this petty power play, over a yard that wasn't even in disarray. He didn't let his patience wear thin, but he knew it was time to stop playing along with Karen's game. "Look," Jamal said, his voice still even, "I'm not trying to cause any problems here. I'm new to the area, just moved in yesterday. But let me make something clear." He took a step closer to Karen and Peter, his eyes focused intently on them. Karen looked up at him, clearly expecting him to back down or comply. But Jamal's steady gaze didn't waver. "What you're not understanding," he continued, his voice cutting through the silence, "is that I'm the one who enforces the rules here. I'm the sheriff of Maplewood Falls." The words landed like a bombshell, and for a moment, neither Karen nor Peter knew how to respond. They both blinked at him, processing the information, as if trying to decipher whether this was some kind of joke or mistake. Jamal stood there, unwavering, watching their reactions carefully. He could practically hear the gears turning in their minds, as they tried to reconcile the man standing in front of them with the authority he had just revealed. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. She glanced at Peter, who looked back at her with wide eyes. It was clear that neither of them had expected this turn of events. The sheriff. This man, their target, had just transformed into their superior. And they hadn't even known it. Jamal watched as the realization dawned on Karen's face. Her initial confidence slowly crumbling. "Wait a minute, you're the new sheriff?" Karen stammered, the incredulity in her voice evident. "The sheriff?" Her words trailed off as she tried to gather herself. Clearly flustered now. "Yes," Jamal answered smoothly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm Jamal Williams, the new sheriff of this town. I've been here all of 24 hours, and already, you've decided to give me a lecture about my yard?" He raised an eyebrow, his voice full of quiet amusement. Peter shifted uneasily, his face flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't known. He hadn't realized the man he'd been so quick to judge was, in fact, the very person in charge of keeping the peace in Maplewood Falls.